motion adopted on October 22nd, 2024, the committee commences its study of electoral. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed to the chair. Members, please raise your hand if you wish to speak, whether participating in person or via Zoom. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. So pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2 and the motion adopted on October 22nd, 2024, the committee commences its study of electoral interference and criminal activities in Canada from agents of the Government of India. I would now like to welcome our witnesses today. From the Privy Council Office, we have Nathalie Drouin, Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council Office and National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. From the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, we have Daniel Rogers, Director. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, David Morrison, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Tricia Geddes, Associate Deputy Minister. And from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have Michael Duheme, Commissioner. So thank you all for being here today on short notice, and I understand Ms. Duran will be leaving in the coming days, so it was really great that we could all fit you in on this day. It has been agreed that Ms. Duran will make an opening statement on behalf of the entire panel. I yield the floor to you, Ms. Duran. Go ahead, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, dear members of the committee. My colleagues and I would like to thank the committee for the invitation to speak with you today regarding public safety of Canadians and foreign interference as it relates to the Government of India. As this committee will understand, while we are here in full collaboration and ready to answer your questions, you are convening this meeting in the middle of important public security investigations, which therefore limit what we can share. We are not in a position to provide details on evidence. However, we can share with you the rationale for concern for public safety, and we can speak about our attempts at cooperation with India and how India's refusal to cooperate led us to where we are today.
Law enforcement has been investigating extreme violence within communities, and CSIS has been looking into India foreign interference for years. As you are aware, on September 18 of last year, the Prime Minister announced in the House of Commons that Canada became aware of credible allegation based on intelligence of a potential link between the killing of a Canadian citizen in Canada and agent of the Government of India. Since the Prime Minister's statement last year, the government's response has followed two separate tracks: law enforcement and diplomatic. The diplomatic track addresses our relations with the Government of India in many areas. And the law enforcement track has focused on public safety and the application of the rule of law. Public safety of Canadians has been the paramount consideration for all our actions when evaluating our relationship with India. We do understand and value all India represents to Canada as an international partner, as well as our significant people-to-people ties. However, we cannot ignore the attempts by agents of the Government of India to engage in coercion and violence in Canada and to undermine our democracy. The RCMP has also sent resources to work directly with India's Central Counter-Terrorism Law Enforcement Agency to allow for cooperation on violence extremism. It's
important for the public to understand what steps have been taken toward cooperation with India throughout a series of meetings. Since August 2023, we have been clear that it is essential for our officials to maintain meaningful channels of communication and cooperation with India. Specifically, we have had engagement between Canada's NSIA, my predecessor, myself, or other Canadian senior officials from GAC, CSIS, or PCO, and India's National Security Advisor on 6 occasions. namely August and September 2023 in New Delhi, November 2023 in Dubai, December 2023 in Saudi Arabia, January 2024 in London, and March 2024 in Dubai.
In May 2024, when the RCMP made arrestation on the Nijjar case. In addition, I spoke on several occasions to the then High Commissioner of India to Canada. The Prime Minister also discussed the matter at the G20 in New Delhi last year with Prime Minister Modi. The government of India's response was to spread a false narrative that Canada showed them no evidence and that we were ignoring their concerns about Khalistani violence extremism. After months of investigation and several updates, the RCMP approached the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and I in late August of this year to present serious concerns for public safety and explore all potential tools available to us to disable India's network in Canada. This unprecedented request from the RCMP during an ongoing investigation spoke to the seriousness of the risk posed to Canadians and people living in Canada. The evidence revealed the modus operandi used by India to target people living in Canada. The government of India mode of operating starts with the collection of information on Canada's based individuals through diplomats and consular officials in Canada and also other individuals acting as proxies. Some of these individuals and businesses were coerced and threatened. This information is then shared with senior levels of the government of India, who then direct the commission of serious criminal activities against Indo-Canadians through the kinetic use of Lawrence Bishnoi's organized crime network. Bishnoi is currently in jail in India and is able to order these actions through his gang, which has extensive criminal networks in India and internationally. Serious crimes committed in Canada include homicides, assassination plots, perpetrated extortions, and other extreme violence. Given how alarming the evidence was, we knew we had to act and act quickly. Our actions were driven by a pressing and serious concern for public safety. We needed the agent of the government of India to stop their illegal activities in Canada and sought a collaborative approach with Indian officials. Nous nous sommes préparés à trois
We prepared ourselves for three scenarios for the government of India's possible reactions. First of all, cooperative, where India ceases its activities in Canada and demonstrates accountability. Somewhat cooperative reaction or an uncooperative reaction, no accountability and denial. Of course, our desired outcome to address the public safety concerns of Canada was without any doubt the cooperative scenario.
To meet their Indian counterparts to share evidence on two unsuccessful occasions. First, the RCMP was scheduled to travel to India to meet with their law enforcement counterparts. Unfortunately, India used an administrative technicality to block this meeting from occurring. Second, the RCMP traveled to Washington on October 10, while the Indian officer confirmed the meeting, they never showed up. To signal the seriousness of the matter, the RCMP Deputy Commissioner, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and myself traveled to Singapore to meet with the India National Security Advisor on October 12. The Deputy Commissioner spoke to and demonstrated a body of evidence that established clear links between agents of the government of India and violent criminal activities taking place in Canada. We provided three options to the India National Security Advisor that would allow us to address public safety and accountability. The first option was to waive immunities of the diplomats and consulate involved in the scheme to allow for the RCMP to question them. The second option, the comprehensive option, was for India to take accountability and manage the violence by first stopping their illegal activities in Canada, including directing Bishnoi to cease and desist. Second, by issuing a public statement to adopt a mechanism to look into the modus operandi within India, as they have done with the US case. Third, by recalling their diplomats involved in the scheme. And fourth, finally, by announcing a new India-Canada high-level dialogue on countering extremism. If the first two options were to be refused, Canada would declare the diplomats persona non grata, and RCMP would issue a public statement to explain the situation to Canadians, what we call the unilateral option. In order to address Canada's serious public safety, our objective, as I said before, was the accountability option. While during the meeting, our counterpart did not refuse to look into the accountability option, he refused to acknowledge any links and deny everything we presented. We eventually agreed to pause, keep the meeting confidential, as suggested by my counterpart, and reconvene on October 14, Monday, Thanksgiving, to further discuss. Instead, government of India chose to not respect our agreement and go public the next day, Sunday, October 13, and use again their false narrative that Canada has not shown any evidence. By going public, the government of India clearly signaled that they were not going to be accountable or take the necessary actions we needed to ensure public safety. It then became clear to the RCMP that we had to take the unilateral option, meaning PNG the diplomats, and issue a public statement. We also decided to roll out our media engagement strategy to seek a broader audience and maximize impact. Deputy Minister Morrison and I spoke to the Washington Post on background late Sunday afternoon, October 13. We provided non-classified information on the action we had taken to cooperate with India and explained how the evidence showed links to the government of India conducting illegal activities against Canadians, including threats to their lives. The government of India has, from the beginning, accused Canada of engaging in a politically motivated investigation and using the Canadian media to further this. This is clearly not the case. However, we were prepared for this accusation to resurface. Therefore, we made a strategic decision to engage a respected international news outlet that had already published on the subject to ensure the record was straight and that our side of the story would be widely heard. Dans l'intérêt de la sécurité publique,
in the interest of public safety and disrupting a network fueling violence in Canadian communities, Minister Joly declared 6 accredited Indian representatives persona non grata. India reciprocated by declaring PNG 6 Canadian officials from our High Commission in New Delhi. This is not a decision that Canada took lightly. Engaging with India is a central component of our Indo-Pacific strategy. Our position should be clear. Canada remains open to cooperation with India, but we need to have a meaningful engagement from India on our grounded and serious concerns. Thank you for your time, and we are available to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. We go now to Ms. Dancho for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here to discuss this very serious development. Certainly, in the RCMP Commissioner, in your own words, are an unprecedented announcement that you and others had made on October 14th, and you had said that the violence orchestrated by India has become, quote, a significant threat to public safety in Canada, with well over a dozen credible and imminent threats to life. And Commissioner Duheme, on October 14th, you said that you had clear evidence that links officials from the Government of India to violent crimes in Canada, but you provided no further details at that time, and you said that you needed to protect the open investigations and court proceedings. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at that time, you were of the opinion that those details, if released, could jeopardize the investigation into the murders and other violent acts by India on Canadians and people residing in Canada. Is that correct?
Yes, and I also comment on the evidence that was presented by Deputy Commissioner Flynn in Singapore with Madame Drouin and Mr. Morrison on the schemes or the modus operandi of how the Government of India operates.
And Ms. Drouin already mentioned this a bit, but you are aware, of course, of the Washington Post article from that same day on October 14th that includes details of this sensitive information that you had chosen not to share because, again, because you felt that it would jeopardize the investigation. Is that correct?
Just for clarity, there's a difference with sensitive information under national security chapeau, but this was the information that's in the article. It was more or less some information from the investigations that we're doing.
So you don't feel that the information in the Washington Post, that those details were sensitive in any way?
Not sensitive to national security as it's portrayed as national security sensitive information. It's information part of investigation, which normally we would like to keep within, but sometimes we do release some information.
So normally you would have kept those details private, but they're of course not private anymore.
I would say on occasion we have come up with some information to stimulate certain things when we're investigating. But this one here, again, is not sensitive, as I mentioned, under the national security definition.
Commissioner, why did you choose not to release the information during your press conference that was at the same time released by the Washington Post? Why were those details kept from the public in Canada?
Because I didn't think at that point it was relevant, that specific information. And again, I wasn't part of the conversation with the Washington Post.
And Ms. Drouin, you were part of that conversation with the Washington Post, is that correct?
Correct.
Correct, and you felt that those details were not sensitive and would not jeopardize any investigation?
So maybe I can share two things. So the information we shared with the journalists over there were not classified. I would like also, and the job of journalists, it may be better than I do, but journalists have also separate sources. That's something that has to be said. As I said also in my opening remarks, this is someone who has followed India's stories many times. And the information that was disclosed in the Washington Post, I think, are also available elsewhere.
You can confirm then that the information about, for example, the Indian Home Affairs Minister and his alleged involvement in these crimes in Canada, that was not released in Canada, however. Can you confirm that? That was only released in the Washington Post, pardon me.
So this is not an information we provided to the journalists.
Pardon me, it was not information you provided?
No.
Who provided that information then to the journalist? You're not sure? But that was not yourself who provided that information, was it?
We did not.
Mr. Morrison, can you comment? Did you provide
Sure.
that information?
The journalist called me and asked me if it was that person. I confirmed it was that person.
Oh, you confirmed. So you did.
This is a journalist who's written extensively on this topic. A journalist that has various sources. He asked me if that was one of the people, and I confirmed that it was.
Thank you, Mr. Morrison. In that day, you can confirm, both Mr. Drouin and Mr. Morrison, that the Prime Minister did not release these information to the Canadian public, but it was released in the Washington Post, correct?
Released in the Washington Post, yes. I'm just racking my memory for exactly what the Prime Minister said.
Mr. Drouin, you advise the Prime Minister on issues of national security and intelligence, correct? You're the top advisor in Canada, is that correct?
Correct.
Did you advise him not to release that information publicly in Canada?
So we worked with the Prime Minister and the different ministers in terms of their public statements. And I think this is what I can say. Like we advised and we review what was going to be the Q&As and the public statement by the Prime Minister and the different ministers.
I'm trying to understand why it is the Washington Post received information when the Deputy Commissioner, or pardon me, the Commissioner, the Prime Minister, the Public Safety Minister, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs did not provide that information to Canada. And in fact, Canadians wouldn't know unless they were able to read the Washington Post. I just find that quite unfair to the Canadian public that details were released in advance to the Washington Post and confirmed, according to Mr. Morrison, to the Washington Post, but not provided to Canada. Don't you find that odd?
The reason why we offered, as I said in my opening remarks, a background interview to the Washington Post was really to make sure that our side of the story will become clearly and be widely spread, especially at the international level. That was the strategy behind the background interview we gave.
Thank you.
Dancho? We go now to Mr. Gahir for 6 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. So it was a short while ago that the RCMP announced that they had evidence that agents of the Government of India are actively involved in a network of criminal activity here in Canada that includes homicide, extortion, organized crime, and interference in our democratic process. It's a network of crime that could potentially mean the involvement of some of India's highest-ranking diplomats and politicians. First of all, I'd like to just deeply thank the law enforcement agencies for your work, for uncovering this, for taking the action to protect Canadians. And as I say this, I have a deep recognition that I don't know if you folks quite know what you've done. For many Canadians of Sikh heritage, your words have confirmed what they already knew and felt. For decades in gurdwaras, in homes, behind closed doors, Sikhs knew that they were being watched, that they were being monitored, that we were being targeted. And what you've done is legitimize their concerns with the evidence and investigation that you've engaged in. Every time that there's new information that comes out or an announcement that happens, I'm asked by my colleagues, by my family, by members of the community, how are you and how is the overall community doing? And what I can say is that there's always a deep sigh of relief that their plight is not being ignored, and in fact that it's being heard and it's being acted upon. I think all Canadians can appreciate that the potential link of the murder of a Sikh and other crimes in Canada by the Indian state, it strikes at the very heart of the security that a lot of Sikhs and other communities come to Canada to find. And this is why I think your work is so critical. And I deeply thank you for that work. Ms. Drouin, my first question is for you. A criminal that is jailed in a foreign jail in India that acts on behest of the Indian government for basic immunity to carry out his operations. This is quite literally the plot of several Bollywood movies that I've watched growing up. And it's funny to see that the Indian government takes its hints from Bollywood. My question to you is, this is an individual that's being kept in an Indian jail. There's potential involvement of Indian ministers and diplomats. How far does our jurisdiction reach? What action can be taken against a Lawrence Bishnoi type figure if the evidence actually shows that there is a connection all the way through?
Do you want to have a crack at this? Your question is a very interesting one in terms of the jurisdiction we may have when it comes to law enforcement elsewhere in the world. And this is why, as I presented in my opening remarks, the cooperation mechanism and for India to take accountability and to direct Bishnoi to stop its illegal criminal activities in Canada was essential. And this is why also we wanted to use all the tools available to us, including diplomatic tools. But maybe, Commissioner, you want to add to that?
I could probably add some to that, and I just want to mention that we still have significant ongoing files right now. So to your question, if the evidence supports the involvement of an individual overseas, there's always that possibility to lay charges on Canadian soil. Then you get into the extradition process and whatnot, and if the individual's locked up for the next, I don't know how long he's locked up, that could be challenging, but doesn't mean that we have to recuse ourselves from laying any criminal charges against the individual.
Great. So maybe I can finish the plot line for that movie that the Indian government seems to be wanting to make. When that eventual connection is made between government officials that are using criminals to carry out their targeted hits, their actions that they want to carry out, they usually paint that individual as a rogue agent. And so I assume eventually that is the information that's going to come out when this investigation comes out. My other question is, we know that the Conservative Party leader has engaged in willful blindness. We know that the Conservative Party has said that their leader could be briefed via a TRM, a threat reduction measure. Are you considering briefing him in that way? And could you explain the limitations of a TRM and compared to the amount of information that he could receive if he received top secret security clearance?
Thank you. I'll start and I will go to Director to complete. So in terms of sharing information with different parties, the easiest way for sure is to be able to have a top secret conversation with leaders. That can help us in terms of managing the caucus if needs be, and it is also the simplest way. A threat reduction measure is a mechanism by which some information can be revealed, the essential and necessary information in order to manage the threat. I will let the Director continue, but the TRM is not an equivalent of disclosing TS information to a clear individual.
Thank you, Madam. I can confirm what Nathalie has said. Certainly, TRM requires specific legal thresholds and allows us to provide a subset of information, and we will evaluate whether that's something that we can do. And as we move ahead, without a security clearance at this point, CSIS can't provide a more fulsome brief on a broader set of topics.
C'est maintenant Madame Michaud.
Now, Ms. Michaud, 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses for their presence here. It's greatly appreciated. I have the statement by the RCMP from October 14th before me, the French version. And at the outset, they talk about extraordinary circumstances that led you to disclose certain details of this investigation, which normally you would not publicly disclose when an investigation is ongoing in order to preserve its integrity. So I'm wondering about why you decided to publicly disclose information with regard to that investigation, and what did that allow you to discover? If you check the record now, I know it's difficult to have a record already, but what's the difference between a totally secret investigation and one where certain details were made public? I know that you wanted to send out a warning to certain Canadians that they may be in danger, but was the goal really to protect those people or to obtain other information? Why did you decide to make certain details public? Perhaps Mr. Jem to begin. Well, first of all, Mr. Chairman, the number one priority for any police force is to ensure public safety. And you're right, Ms. Michaud, these were extraordinary circumstances. This is a file I've never seen. If I look of the background of what was done following the announcement of the Nijjar murder in June, we had a press scrum where we announced arrests. We said we had a separate investigation from Mr. Nijjar's homicide, and it targeted certain activities involving the Indian government. Over the year, we saw many situations where people were intimidated, there were homicides, harassment, and we also had opportunities to do a duty to warn. Duty to warn is when we have credible and imminent information about attempts on the life of a person. We have to meet with that person and warn them their life is in danger. So we see an escalation of everything that was going on when it comes to the investigation. And in the course of that investigation, it became clearer and clearer that there were diplomats and officers involved from the consulates, and they were involved in what was going on. So in its investigation, the organization took an unusual decision to protect public safety because of everything we saw. I'd come back to what Ms. Drouin said in her statement. We had options. For us, the RCMP, we wanted to look at how to mitigate risk for public safety. It was the investigation, first and foremost. Sometimes when you go to the media, it can provoke things in the investigation. In our case, Deputy Commissioner Flynn tried to meet with his counterparts in India. They refused. They didn't give him a visa. Plan B in October was to see his counterpart in Washington, D.C. at the Indian consulate, and that too was refused. So we decided that he would join Ms. Drouin and Mr. Morrison in Singapore, and at that meeting, what Deputy Commissioner Flynn explained, what we managed to establish as information and action on the Indian government, Ms. Drouin pointed out, there were objectives set out. They were not met. There was a leak in the Indian media following that meeting that was not supposed to happen, and we decided that there was no appetite there to cooperate with Canada and the RCMP. So it was important for us to go forward. I know many people asked why October 14th. It was a long weekend for me too, but we felt the need to get out there immediately. You heard Ms. Drouin. There was supposed to be a call on October 14th at 10:30, didn't happen. We wanted to avoid misinformation and disinformation, and we wanted to make two things public: ensure public safety and warn people in the communities that we're here. So if you want to meet with us, so that's more or less why we did this. Thank you. And I'm wondering, I don't want to assume anything, but clearly this is a cooperation between all Canadian safety agencies, not just the RCMP. It's cooperation with the government. Was there any pressure by the government to do a public sortie? It's unusual for you to do so. I don't want to get into politics, but we know that the whole foreign interference scandal in Canada did not make Canadians' action very glorious. So there were people pushing for an independent inquiry into foreign interference. So I'm wondering if there was any pressure by the government to show that Canada and safety agencies were united, were proactive, were working on this. Was that part of the discussion to have this public? I think there was no pressure on me. It's the RCMP that brought this to the government. I'm talking about the Minister of Public Safety and the Minister of Global Affairs. We were stuck in a situation where the chance of putting charges are very slim sometimes. So we were looking at alternatives to try to stop the threat and to really address public security. So Ms. Drouin said so earlier, it took about 2 months during which we said we have to put a plan in place. How do we stop this? Perhaps not with police tools, but with the tools available, such as expelling these diplomats. Thank you, Ms. Michaud.
Gregor, please, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to each of you for being here today and assisting our committee in investigating this issue. Of course, October 14th's revelations have to be in the context of what the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons, of the NSICOP report, of the Hogue Commission's initial report, all which extensively mention India. Mr. Wren, I'd like to start with you because, of course, you know, a number of weeks ago, the Prime Minister was before the Hogue Commission and made a pretty stunning allegation naming the Conservative Party parliamentarians who were under threat of foreign interference. He neglected to mention other parties, but I can only surmise that other parties are involved given that both the Hogue Commission and the NSICOP report made mention of other parties. In the context of the Prime Minister's remarks, was the source country of that foreign interference India? Are you able to confirm that?
I mean, if you look at all the public summaries that...
Sorry, I'm just looking for a short answer. Can you determine whether India was the source of the foreign interference, specifically in the context of the Prime Minister's remarks before the Hague Commission?
So I think I need to answer that. If you look at all the public summaries that we have disclosed to the Commission, you'll see that 3 main countries are doing foreign interference: China, Russia, and India. We have others, but those are the 3 main countries. And India is active with all parties, including the Liberals, the Conservatives.
Just like to, sorry, my time is short. You understand the political climate we're operating in. What was the intention of the Prime Minister's remarks? I mean, you must have known what the fallout would be from those remarks. I'm just trying to understand, because we're still wanting to know the names, but of course the names can't be released. I understand there's a wide gulf between evidence and intelligence. What intention was that serving, given the current political climate we're in right now?
So I'm here to talk to you about the facts. What I'm telling you is that India is a player when it comes to foreign interference, and India can target all parties depending on their respective interests.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers, I'd like to turn to you. Welcome to the committee and congratulations on your appointment as Director of CSIS. Is it clear that a security clearance is not automatic for federal party leaders, right? They have to go through the same process as anyone would. Can you confirm that?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, we are in a situation right now with all of this that's going on where Green Party leader Elizabeth May, the BQ leader Yves Blanchette, I believe, is in the process of getting his clearance. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, they have all taken the steps necessary to get that security clearance to be fully briefed. I want to understand from your perspective as the director of CSIS, what is the desired outcome of having federal party leaders briefed? Because I understand they are under the obligations of the Security of Information Act. But what is the intention to have them briefed, i.e., what are the desired outcomes and actions that you are hoping for by having them briefed?
Thank you for that question, and maybe Madame Drouin would like to add. I think from our perspective, the more knowledgeable that party leaders are about the threat of foreign interference and some of the specifics that we've seen through our intelligence, the more they can be aware and the more they may be able to take actions appropriate within their own parties. It is...
But you said actions within their own parties. So we've had complaints from the Conservative Party leader saying that it's going to gag him and he can't speak publicly about it, and I think we all understand that. But in terms of actions, because I think this is the crux of the issue, what specific actions can a party leader take without breaching the Security of Information Act that would, I guess, give CSIS confidence that we're treating this as seriously as it should be?
I might say that a part of those conversations we could have with party leaders is around particular types of intelligence that we might see, and engaging in a dialogue with those leaders about what actions they feel they may be able to take and how we might be able to provide information or disclose information to help them take those actions. But a dialogue on that would start that process. I think there are actions that party leaders could take if we were aware of certain types of threats, and that might involve looking at the way that their party is operating. I don't want to speak to any hypothetical situations, and I would say that a lot of that will be case specific.
I appreciate you don't want to speak in hypotheticals, but I guess theoretically, given how much power a party leader has, that could be steps such as maybe keeping certain individuals away from certain parliamentary activities, and maybe to the most extreme of preventing someone who might be completely compromised from running under the party's banner in the next election. Is that something that could be done?
I mean, again, I don't really want to speak to specifics. I think party leaders know their roles better than I do. I think our objective from the perspective of the service is to give them the information that we can enable them to make good decisions.
Did you have anything to add to that? Mr. Rogers had signaled to you.
So I totally agree with that. I guess you know that leaders of parties can manage their party, their members of caucus, so that management authority gave them a series of tools in terms of responding to the intelligence that we can share with them.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. We go now to Ms. Dancho, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wright, you are the National Security Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister, so you take direction from him, and do you take direction from anyone else in his office, his Chief of Staff, for example?
No. I do
Only
not.
from the Prime Minister. Did the Prime Minister authorize you to leak this information to the Washington Post?
The Prime Minister did not direct us in terms of the media strategy. That was a strategy that we developed at the civil servant level. PMO and other MOs were aware of that mitigating strategy if India wished to not collaborate with us, but Prime Minister did not direct us to do it, nor they approve what was going to be shared with the Washington Post.
As you said, they were aware that you were about to do it. Is that correct?
The old strategy has been shared with the Prime Minister and his office.
Including leaking the information to the Washington
We did not leak information to the Washington Post.
My apologies, providing sensitive information to the Washington Post that you did not provide publicly to anyone else.
We did not provide any classified information to the Washington Post.
Sensitive intelligence was provided to the Washington Post that was not provided to Canadian journalists, correct?
So the conversation we had with the Washington Post, I think I have explained already what was the purpose of that, and the parameter of the conversation has been discussed amongst ourselves.
I appreciate that. It would seem like a leak because it wasn't provided to Canadian journalists. It wasn't provided to the Canadian public. In fact, the Canadian public would not be aware unless they read the Washington Post and subsequent Canadian reporting on what was included in the Washington Post. And from my perspective, that certainly seems like a leak, and it certainly is concerning that that was done without knowledge of Canadian officials who are reporting on this, Ms. Duran, but I appreciate your perspective on that. To the Commissioner...
J'aimerais donner l'occasion à mon collègue.
I'd like to give my colleague an opportunity to answer.
The same issue.
Sure.
Within our strategy, we were talking to different audiences. And so we deliberately chose, as Madame Drouin said in her introductory remarks, a credible, internationally read newspaper that would carry our side of the story. We chose a journalist who had a long record of background in this particular issue. He had written on it a number of times before. And through the Washington Post, we were speaking directly to our friends in the United States. We were speaking to our allies in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, and we were also speaking directly to Indians.
Mr. Morrison, just on that then, so the leak or the non-leak was an effort to get the Americans on board for the Canadian perspective. Was it an effort then, in other words, to have American elected officials, those in the President's office, for example, read the Washington Post and be further compelled to back up Canada in this regard? Was that sort of, in other words, in plain language, is that what the objective was?
What I would say is that we approached this whole series of events, including our approach that we adopted in going to Singapore. We were talking to our closest allies who share similar concerns from the beginning.
Okay, thank you, Thank you, Deputy Minister. To the Commissioner, just in your original press release, you'd mentioned that in February 2024, the RCMP created a multidisciplinary team to investigate and coordinate efforts to combat this threat. Who initiated that multidisciplinary team, and who were the members of it? In that, were they beyond the RCMP? Did they include members at this table today, for example?
There's two teams that we initiated. One with all the extortions and harassment that we're seeing predominantly in Alberta, Vancouver, as well as in Toronto general area. We had a coordination team out of BC that was looking after that, but we also felt the need to put a team together to look at violent extremists and foreign interference, which involves several government departments that are part of this task force.
Who initiated that?
I believe that Deputy Commissioner Flynn initiated that.
Okay, so it was not direction from anyone at this table or anyone from the Prime Minister's office
No.
to engage in. Was that team central to the subsequent events that we heard over Thanksgiving?
I would say that team, there was already independent investigations going on before this team was created. This was more to bring a whole government approach as what we're seeing from the intelligence-wise from the criminal side.
To my final seconds here. So this was the first time that a whole of government approach was taken, was February 2024.
At this size, yes. But other than that, there's daily work with the service and other government departments on a ad hoc basis when required.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. We go now to Mr. Dhaliwal for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, as you know, Mr. Nijjar was my constituent and was assassinated on a sovereign religious place to the Sikhs. So it is clearly an attack on Canadian sovereignty as well as Sikh sovereignty as well. Mr. Rogers earlier mentioned that TRM will not do the whole thing, the clearance. And what I'm hearing on the ground is that Mr. Pierre Poilievre is not doing the responsible thing to take the clearance. And not only that, we have heard extensive calls, for the Conservative leader of the opposition to do responsible thing and get his clearance. Can you explain to this committee why it would be the responsible thing to do for Mr. Pierre Poilievre to get the clearance? Mr. Rogers. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I think I would just say that the responsibility of the service is to do everything that it can to protect public safety and to reduce the threat of foreign interference from India in Canada. From our perspective, if a leader chooses to take a clearance, we will provide the information that I spoke to earlier, and that we would do everything we could to enable that that information to be provided to make the best decisions in the interest of Canadians within that party. If a leader chooses not to get a clearance, then we will continue to evaluate other mechanisms available to us to help to reduce that threat. That can include threat reduction measures or others. If a leader chooses to have a clearance, we can have a broader conversation with them about the details of the threat and certain types of intelligence.
Thank you. And you have mentioned the threats, and particularly India. What are some of these specific indicators of foreign interference from India that CSIS has identified, and what are steps CSIS is taking to prevent foreign interference in Canadian political process as well as to protect Canadian citizens?
Thank you. It is a very good question. Obviously, you've heard from the Commissioner earlier about some of the most egregious examples of criminality that the RCMP has uncovered with links to the Government of India. I would say that from a CSIS perspective, we could add to that some of the things that we have been saying to the public recently, which is that the Government of India seeks to advance pro-India narratives and align Canada's position with the position of India. This is particularly true when it comes to individuals that India perceives to support a pro-Khalistani independence movement, which is a particular sore point for India. We see India using proxy agents here in Canada to try and advance those goals. And we can see different types of foreign interference attempts ranging from disinformation to criminal activities that the RCMP has mentioned to be able to achieve those goals. Obviously, this is a concern for the service, and as Madame Drouin has said earlier, this is something we've been tackling for a number of years. We do investigations to try and uncover information. We use the information uncovered to work with our partners across the Government of Canada and our allies. We, in an effort to protect public safety, if we see information that could be harmful to an individual in Canada, we work very closely with police of jurisdiction and the RCMP to make sure public safety is assured by sharing that information through a robust framework. And where necessary, we can do things like threat reduction measures. The last thing I would say on that point is we have well, not just recently, but especially recently engaged in a lot of stakeholder and community outreach to make sure that we build resilience across the various communities that could be threatened by foreign interference by India and others. And Bill C-70 has helped us do that through a new ability to have resilience disclosures with Canadians.
Thank you. My question is Commissioner Duheme. In the recent CTV news article, you stated that there has been significant reduction to the public safety threat since the 6 Indian diplomats were expelled from the country. What are some of the specific indicators has led to the assessment that there has been a significant reduction in public safety threats?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And I mentioned earlier that throughout a period of a year and a half, it ebbed and flowed from significant to imminent, and that's when we did duty to warrants. But the actions that were taken on October 14th, our press release, as well as the Government of Canada, Global Affairs Canada's position with the 6 diplomats, we know through our current investigations that we have in place that we've had a significant impact on the threat to public safety to those communities.
Okay. How is the RCMP is engaging with the communities to address concerns about the threats that India poses to particular communities?
We encourage people to, we do have an engagement strategy in which we have individuals that will reach out to the community. Sometimes we will work as well with the police's jurisdiction liaison people for these communities. And it's to build that trust and build those relationships so people feel comfortable coming forward, explaining what they went through or what they've witnessed. And that was, it was part of the reason as well as to go out publicly, is to get that trust from the community that we're there. We're actioning items to reduce action. We're putting actions in place to reduce public safety, but if they see anything, to come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal. On y va maintenant, Madame Michaud.
We'll now go to Ms. Michaud. 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, you said that the investigation allowed you to find out the modus operandi of India. Given that information, are you able to prevent what could happen? Let me explain. Sometimes we don't get cooperation. We clearly don't have it in this case from the Indian government. But having the kind of information you have, can you see the investigation progress even without their cooperation? Two little things here. What we saw here in Canada is not unique because the U.S. did lay charges against two people, one who's an official representative of the government of India and another one from organized crime. Very similar to what we saw in Canada, a contract against an American citizen, a contract to kill him. So it's not unique. So it demonstrates how the government of India operates. To our mind, we have a much better understanding of how the information and directives come from the Indian government to here. And these diplomats who were sent home, the fact that we were able to accumulate enough evidence to convince the government to expel these diplomats says a lot about the work we've done. Ms. Drouin talked about one of the options, which was to lift the diplomatic immunity of these people before expelling them. According to my understanding, we can't do that. It's really the country that these diplomats represent. They can lift the immunity. So does that put spokes in your wheels? You can't proceed with arrests? Or is it better to simply expel them? Is there one option that's better than another for you? Well, thank you. First of all, of course, since these diplomats enjoy immunity, it does make the investigative work much more difficult. And that's why the first option was to ask India to lift immunity in order to allow us to apply the law against them. We did not expect India to accept that first option. That's why we developed another more integrated option of accountability and make them stop directing violent crime in Canada.
Mr. McGregor, please, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think for my next series of questions, I'll turn to you, Mr. Morrison, and maybe to you, Mr. Rogers, as a follow-up. With all of the revelations that have been made over the past year or so concerning the government of India's interference, I mean, we heard earlier of what India's strategic objectives are in Canada to, I guess, have a more pro-India stance in Canada. And I guess in the short term, that seems to have backfired spectacularly given the negative news that is now cycling through Canada. But Mr. Morrison, what I wanted to ask you is, you know, is the department satisfied with Canada's allies' response to this? Do we feel like we're getting sufficient backup and confirmation of our concerns from some of our closest allies about these very strong allegations? I mean, we are basically accusing the Indian government of working hand in hand with serious criminal organizations involved in everything from murder to extortion and coercion. Are you satisfied that our allies are in lockstep with us on this approach to the government of India?
I am absolutely satisfied that our allies are advocating on our behalf. You've seen the public statements, and we know for a fact that they have been advocating privately with our counterparts in India.
Okay. Maybe, Mr. Rogers, I'll turn to you because, of course, Canada belongs to an exclusive club, the Five Eyes, and there's some fantastic relations there, great intelligence sharing. Have your counterparts in the other 4 countries, have they been able to confirm sort of an increase in India's activities in their respective countries? Like, is this a concern shared by your other 4 counterparts to whatever degree in their home countries?
Thanks for the question. Obviously, I can't speak to the specifics of what other countries have seen from an intelligence perspective. I can say, similar to what Mr. Morrison said, that we enjoy extremely strong relationships with our Five Eyes partners and more broadly across the world. And we speak about this issue of foreign interference increasingly, including around India, within our service and within others like CSE and other government partners. I think foreign interference as a topic on the whole with India and others forms more a part of those conversations, and I expect that to continue, especially in light of these revelations.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. We go now back to Ms. Dancho. Ms. Dancho, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner, again, on the February 2024 that you created this multidisciplinary team, you said that it sort of brought people together to work on this issue. Is it folks at this table, or who other outside the RCMP was engaged in this at that time?
So you would have some of the normal partners that we have: CSIS, CSC, CBSA, FinTrack, RRCC, RCMP, multiple sections within the RCMP, and obviously police jurisdiction when we look at the extortion cases in Alberta, Toronto, and BC.
Global affairs included in that?
I don't think so. This was more on a, well, I do have others where DOJ and GAC, but most of it is all the, I'd say the practitioners when it comes to law enforcement or security mandate.
Okay, it's my understanding from this testimony and others that it was about 8 weeks before this announcement on October 14th that the RCMP sort of came together with the other officials at this table. Is that correct?
No, in the sense that Madame Drouin did say, or Mr. Morrison said, about 8 weeks when we started planning on the diplomatic side. But there have been regular briefings as to just to inform the speed and flow of the investigation.
Ms. Drouin had mentioned there were diplomatic outreach to India in November 2023. That was the first of this event. Is that correct, Ms. Drouin? Can you just correct me? You had said it in your opening statement.
So back then in August 2023, it is important to remember that we were talking about the Nijjar murder, while what we have talked about since Thanksgiving is a broader set of violences in Canada. But regarding the Nijjar murder, we have started our diplomatic outreach with India in August 2023, so prior to the Prime Minister's statement. And as I testified, we had many other meetings with them.
Did you have other conversations with the Prime Minister following his statement in the House of Commons on September 18th between then and in the few weeks leading up to October 14th of this year?
The Commissioner said, Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner offered, and I said that also in my opening remarks, several updates on this file to the Prime Minister and myself over the last year.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to understand, we had this unprecedented event where the Prime Minister stood in the House of Commons and made this quite extraordinary claim that India was responsible for the murder of, Canadian. And then 11 months later, on October 14th, 2024, we see that there was quite a phenomenal escalation of the concern to those in Canada and Canadian citizens and others from India. So from an outsider perspective, there was that statement made in the House of Commons, and things got extraordinarily worse despite the number of efforts you have outlined that you have made in that time. I'm trying to understand where the failure was to stop this. Perhaps you can shed some light on that, Ms. Drouin. Why were all these efforts that you've said that you've done, why were they not successful? It got to a point where 13 individuals were in peril 11 months later.
Le commissaire l'a dit, et je le...
The Commissioner said it, and I repeat, for many years now, there have been investigations about violence against Canadians of Indian origin on Canadian soil. One of the reasons, and you're completely right in saying that violence has escalated, unfortunately, after August 2023, and it's precisely that escalation of violence that led the RCMP to having talks with Global Affairs Canada so that we can look at the use of all available tools to put a stop to that network of violence. And the first thing that needed to be done was to make this network of data collection impossible.
My concluding few moments. It seems like it took prompting from the RCMP for Global Affairs and yourself to really insist on this quite unprecedented diplomatic action to expel 6 diplomats. Why did it take the RCMP sort of initiating those conversations to get it to such a point?
Une chose que je pourrais rajouter.
One thing I could add is that in 2023, we worked on the basis of intelligence, credible intelligence on the involvement of India in Nijjar's murder. What we've been talking about publicly in the past 2 weeks is the result of serious investigations. So I think it's important to make that distinction. It's the very hard work of multidisciplinary teams led by the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner that allowed us to shed light on this stratagem. There's the ones who realized that investigations were to continue, but while they continued, we had to take the action necessary to put an end to this network of violence.
Going now to Mr. Sarai. Mr. Sarai, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank you all for your very professional and thorough role in uncovering the egregious breach of Canadian sovereignty and safety of Canadians by India. It's also very sad to see that my colleagues from the Conservative Party have not asked not one question in the House or in here, in the press, on India's involvement in these crimes, but it's all been about your role in sharing information to counter disinformation with the Washington Post. And while this is the greatest threat to Canadian sovereignty that we have faced in at least my generation. This is sad and goes beneath my lowest expectation of the Conservative Party of Canada. Every Canadian of Sikh heritage, South Asian heritage, deserves better. It has just been heard that India has a very pro-India agenda that they want to implement in Canada, and a leader who is said to have received support from India prefers silence, not to see the evidence, rather than address the issue that is facing the threat of our democracy. I'll let Canadians figure out the correlation between the three. My first question is to you, Mr. Duheme, or Mr. Rogers can answer. Have you seen evidence of any other democratic country that has gathered information on Canadians, passed it up to its capital, then given the information to organized crime to conduct such heinous crimes as murder, extortion, and shootings in Canada?
Mr. Chair, I will limit my comments to, we do have ongoing foreign interference investigations, so in considering that they're ongoing, I'm not going to comment on that. But going back to the India side, we did see the indictment of 2 Indians in India on a planned murder on a U.S. citizen, so that dictates that other countries are probably going through what we're going through with the same modus operandi.
What I'm asking is, any other countries, have they used that modus operandi on Canadians that we've seen in the past, whether publicly aware or to this degree, which includes murder and extortion?
I would say not to that extent.
Can I ask you another question? Has any of your actions been political or politically motivated?
Not at all. As I mentioned earlier, this is an RCMP lead investigation, and we actually brought it to the attention of the government.
Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre, ever contacted you, Mr. Duheme, or your department, or Mr. Rogers, or Ms. Drouin, for a briefing on the transnational aggression by India against Canadian citizens?
Not my office.
Ms. Drouin?
I'd like to say that I had an opportunity to give a briefing along with my colleagues to all the opposition leaders about the situation we're discussing right now.
Contacted you for a separate briefing?
No, it's us who have offered to all leaders individual briefings on this actual situation.
Mr. Rogers?
I'm not aware of any such recent request, although I will say I've just joined the service within a day, so
What are you doing to prevent proxies working in Canada that are working for the government of India or other countries in terms of preventing them from continuing to do this, either charges, deportations, or protection in the case if they're being threatened or coerced to provide information? What are the tools in that? And whatever you can disclose, obviously, it's ongoing.
One of the main tools is engagement with the communities and having people come forward. That's one of the main ones for us, is we want people to have confidence in law enforcement and to come forward if they've witnessed it or heard it. We also have a 1-800 line which people can report on a 1-800 line. And we also work very closely with the service and other partners to make sure that we're in lockstep when it comes to intelligence and threats to the Canadian people.
The way they gather information is through these proxies, and I would consider that a criminal activity if you're going against the Canadians and providing information for the purposes of criminal activity. I'm asking what measures are being used to prevent other proxies or the current proxies from doing this.
Well, one's an awareness, because I will admit we've been using two terms, agents and proxies, and the definition that we've been using is an agent would be the organized crime group that's doing the work on behalf of consular officials and the government of India. Proxies are more people within the community that are sometimes recruited, sometimes probably getting engaged without even knowing it. A simple task of, did you see that person, or what's the address of the person's residence, without even knowing it. And some could have been coerced in doing it because of threats to families or because of threats to their lives.
Thank you, Mr. Sarai. We'll start our third round now with Mr. Lloyd. Mr. Lloyd, please go ahead, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start with Commissioner Duheme. Were any of the killers, the alleged killers of Mr. Nijjar, known to the RCMP before the killings took place in that investigation?
The Nijjar case right now is before the courts, and I'm not going to make any comments on the Nijjar file as it's before the courts. Disclosure will happen in due course through the judicial process.
But it's been publicly reported that the 4 killers, we have Hardeep Singh, Karen Brar, Karen Preet Singh, Kamal Preet Singh, forgive me if the pronunciation's incorrect, these alleged killers were all temporary residents. Is that the case?
I would have to go back in my notes to confirm that these were all temporary residents. I couldn't answer.
Reported in the news. Can any of the other witnesses comment on that? This has been publicly reported in the Toronto Sun. Was nobody aware at our RCMP services that of any criminal background of these characters before they were allowed to come to Canada?
I'm not saying that nobody is not aware. What I'm saying is the matter is before the courts, and we're not going to comment on it.
Well, this has nothing to do with the current investigation, Commissioner, but it has a concern. It has a concern about whether or not our country is prepared to protect our national security. That's what we're talking about today. And if people with criminal backgrounds are coming to our country, being allowed to come to our country through the temporary resident program and possibly through the international student program, that's a serious breach of our national security. And that's our immigration system after 9 years of this Liberal government. In the case of Hardeep Singh, who has been accused of killing Mr. Nijjar, were you aware that Hardeep Singh was on bail when the killing took place of Mr. Nijjar?
Again, I'd have to go through my notes of the briefing because it happened quite some time ago, and a lot of things have happened since then.
Well, I guess I'll enlighten the committee. As was reported in the Toronto Sun, there was a March 2023 warrant for fleeing police and the dangerous operation of a motor vehicle in Surrey, BC last November. He was pinched on firearms and drug charges in Brampton. He was out on bail at the time of the Peel Region incident. He agreed in Surrey that he wouldn't possess firearms or ammo or get behind the wheel of the car. He made his first court appearance in June 16th of 2023. 2 days later, this is according to the Toronto Sun, Sikh Canadian activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar was killed. Why are these dangerous criminals who are here as temporary residents, possibly here as international students, I don't know what educational institution they're attending, why are they allowed to be out on bail? This is like, if we're watching these people, we know they're a threat to national security. Why are they here? Why are they allowed to be out on bail? Why are they allowed to walk Canadian streets?
Chair, the answer to that, I think one is the process of providing them visas or access to entry into Canada. It's best to be posed to IRCC. And if people are released on bail before the courts, that's got nothing to do with the RCMP. It's a judicial process that we operate within.
I think Canadians will be somewhat concerned. We have, many of the lead figures from our national security establishment, and there doesn't appear to be any sort of coordination between Immigration Canada, between our security services, and I'm not getting a lot of confidence today that our national security is being protected in this country under this government when it appears that our immigration system has been compromised in this case, when it appears that our justice system is being compromised, and these accused killers are being allowed to walk on the street and go after Canadian citizens, particularly Canadian citizens of Sikh background. I think that's deeply concerning to me, and I think that should be a major focus of what this investigation is. What processes did our country have that could have prevented this? Yes, we can talk about briefing foreign media outlets in order to get this information out. We can talk about the fact that the Prime Minister had information on this, but if we're not fixing our systems like our immigration system and our justice system, it's going to allow these very dangerous criminals to walk on our street. How long have you been investigating, Commissioner Duheme, how long have you been investigating Indian foreign interference on Canadian soil?
Oh, I wouldn't be able to provide the committee with an exact date.
It just seems to me that this has become an issue very recently, and I suspect it has been a long time issue, but it really seems to have come to a boil in the last few years. Can you tell this committee maybe why this has become an issue in the last few years? It seems to have become a big issue.
Whole question, I would take you back when the director of CSIS, former director David Vigneault, brought to the forefront the immediate risk to Canadians with the ideological motivated violent extremists. That was pretty new to us because it wasn't on the radar. And I would say foreign interference, although it was probably happening way before it came to the forefront like it is right now. But I think it's a phenomenon that we've learned over the years, and it's present more now than what we've seen before because there's probably more intelligence and work being done.
But I'm not saying that this has never been an issue and that it only became an issue recently. This has obviously been a serious issue, and so thank you for that.
Thank you. We seem to have the bells. Let's find out what's going on with the bells for a minute. Actually, while we're finding out, we'll go to Ms. DeMoff for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I want to start by sincerely thanking all of you and the people that work with you for the work that you've done on this. I think it was a shock for me to just see how pervasive this issue was in Canada and how Canadian lives were being put at risk. So I just sincerely thank you to all of you for the work that you've done. I do, just quickly before I get to some of the questions I had, Ms. Drouin, you looked like you wanted to say something to the previous question. I just wondered if you could respond, please.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I just want to say that we take the immigration security screening very seriously. It's a process that involves IRCC, CBSA, CSIS, RCMP. Yes, as any other field, always room for improvement, but it is not something that we are not taking, as I said, seriously. I need also to say that we cannot take for granted that those individuals came to Canada with criminal backgrounds. maybe it is sometimes the situation, but we cannot take for granted that it is always the situation. And, you know, doing a good screening also involves having a very good partnership and relation with the country of origin, as we need to also rely on their own information. So those are the information that I want, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
No, that's okay. I mean, would you rely on a police record check from India in doing screening? I would think that there may be security concerns with doing that.
So we never 100% rely, for sure, but it is an important input. But we need to do all separate also monitoring.
Probably better directed at the IRCC, but Commissioner Duheme, I had a question for you. You had mentioned that the RCMP brought this issue to the government, and I wondered if you could just quickly clear up. There have been allegations that the Prime Minister directed you to go public on Thanksgiving Monday. Was that the case?
No, it wasn't the case. And I've shared earlier that we never actually pinpoint October 14th as that date. We knew that we wanted to come proactively, but then when you look at the efforts that Madame Drouin and Mr. Morrison took in Singapore, the lack of engagement by Indian officials with our Deputy Commissioner Flynn, the leaks to the media, the fact that they didn't want to talk to us on Monday, October 14th, we said there's no sense of delaying this. Let's go right away to inform the Canadian public.
One of the things that our study is looking at is the misinformation and disinformation that's being put out by the government of India. And I'm wondering if you can maybe, I'm not sure who is best placed for this, maybe CSIS, or I'll let you decide. Talk about the disinformation campaign that's going on now and the impact that it can have on Canadians because of the information that they're putting out.
Obviously, really important issue, misinformation, not just from a state of India, but there are a number of states that we are concerned about how dis and misinformation might be affecting Canadians. I think colleagues will be aware that we have established a counter foreign interference coordinator at Public Safety. And in addition to some of my colleagues earlier have spoken about engagement and outreach being a really core component of that, also understanding mis and disinformation and deliberating on how we can best provide information to Canadians that counteracts that dis and misinformation, identifies it, calls it out when we see it happening. This is an area of significant effort on behalf of public safety right now.
Thank you. And Chair, I'd just like to read this notice of motion, and I don't want to do anything with it today, that the committee summon Liam Donovan and Lauren Southern to testify on their own for no less than 2 hours on their participation in Russian-backed interference and far-right disinformation campaigns intended to manipulate the Canadian public, and that they appear before November 29th. So I'm just giving notice of that today. I only have 30 seconds left. I wonder if you might be able to give us some examples of the type of disinformation that India is engaged in on this particular issue.
Well, maybe I can go back to what I've said before. India spread that we have not shared with them any evidence. And they also spread that the fact that we do have violence in Canada is because we are not taking extreme violence seriously.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. We go now to Ms. Michaud. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît. 2 minutes and demi, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The special report by the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Interference indicated that after China, India is the one that has the most interference in Canadian institutions. Apparently there are activities that go beyond pro-Khalistan demands expressed in Canadian society, interference in Canadian institutions, targeting Canadian politicians and media, ethno-Indian institutions, and so on. So we have evidence that there is a person in Canada who might be in danger. You meet with that person. So I was going to ask you, what can you offer that person in terms of protection? Can the RCMP offer protection to those people? And that leads me to another question. Do you only meet the people whose lives are in danger, or do you also meet those who might be suspected of participating in foreign interference? Sometimes, if you're talking about politicians, there might be people who participated without even noticing it. Somebody who goes on a parliamentary mission abroad and has a drink with a colleague from another country, shares information about Canada without realizing that this is privileged information. Do you do that kind of meeting too with people that you think may have cooperated with India in this case? Or is it just people whose lives are in danger? Because there's this whole debate about the names that the Prime Minister mentioned. The Leader of the Opposition doesn't want to get the security clearance to warn these people. Is it the Leader of the Opposition who could warn them, or are you in a position to warn people who may be implied in foreign interference? Sorry about my long question. When it comes to the duty to warn people whose lives are in danger, the role of the RCMP is not only to provide them with protection, but tell them about the credible and imminent threat. We would offer the person certain suggestions on maybe not follow the same routine every day, educate them about cybersecurity. There's no cookie-cutter approach for each case. We try to educate people to change their habits. The other question I would say you should put to their service, because what you're saying right now, the RCMP will get involved in foreign interference when there's criminal activity. But beyond that, if there's intelligence that's being shared, because so-and-so met with so-and-so, I think that CSIS would be in a better position to meet with that person. If there's any time left, I would ask Mr. Rogers to answer. We have these kinds of meetings
many times over the last number of years. And we also, just to add to what the Commissioner said, we've done that with partners and community groups, not just individuals, but where we see that there might be groups of individuals that could be the targets of a particular government's foreign interference strategy. With Public Safety Canada, the RCMP and others, we can engage them.
Merci, Madame.
When it comes to discussions with elected officials, sometimes they're not always aware. We have a more global issue of the strategy. It's important to warn them when we know something. Thank you.
Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, maybe I'll turn a question to the Department of Public Safety because the RCMP, CBSA, and CSIS all operate under your ministry's wheelhouse. And this this committee has been looking at a previous issue of how a couple of Egyptian nationals were able to come into Canada, and there was that foiled plot in Toronto, which was thankfully stopped before it could be executed. But we now have a situation where a foreign government is actively collaborating with a criminal element named the Bishnoi gang. And I guess, I know that your department is still doing some internal investigations about, how did IRCC and CBSA coordinate and what went wrong. But what are some of the added challenges when a foreign government is working with a criminal activity? And is that informing how your department is having to look at maybe some of the people who might be coming from India? We don't want to put anyone under the spotlight, but we have a previous experience where someone did get in who shouldn't have been here. Just wondering if you can comment on that.
Sure. The short answer If the question is are we in a process of continuous review and understanding how these threats need to be properly identified through our security screening process? The short answer is yes. You properly referenced that IRCC and we are engaged in a bit of a lessons learned exercise to ensure we have a really good understanding of some recent cases. And part of that process, though, will involve looking at other recent cases, looking at other threat actors, and how can we ensure that whilst no system is ever going to be perfect, that the system is as robust as it possibly can be. So we're engaged in that process right now. I wouldn't say that it's new. This is a continuous engagement that we're undertaking with IRCC, and as you pointed out, with all the agencies that report to the Department of Public Safety.
And very, very quickly, Commissioner Duheme, just from the RCMP's perspectives, I mean, you know, a lot of collaboration is required amongst various police forces around the world. What are some of the added challenges that you're now experiencing with the involvement of the Bishnoi gang?
Well, we had good working relationships with the Indian National Investigation Agency. They were actually here in Canada over the years to understand our judicial process, and we also sent a team over there. And obviously with what happened, we have to rebuild those relationships because we do have things in common. When I think of violent extremists, it's not only happening here in Canada, but it's also happening in India. So there are common interests there, and we want to renew those relationships so we can work together for a common cause.
Mr. McGregor. We go now to Mr. Motz for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for being here, witnesses. And Commissioner, I specifically want to thank you for the work that you and your members have done on this file. That you didn't give it up 11 months ago and longer. And thank you for the work that you've done and bringing this as far as you have. And I wish you the best in continuing to work on it. I do have a question. When you're dealing with sensitive national security information, not necessarily you, Commissioner, maybe this is more Mr. Drouin. When you're dealing with national security, sensitive national security information, who can declassify that? Who has the authority to do that?
The owner of the intelligence products. So, for example, let's say you have something that have been published or released.
That's the standard in the intel world. The owner can release it. Now you are a consumer of that. You don't create your own intel. You're as the national security intelligence advisor to the PM. You're the consumer of intelligence, right?
Right.
So who did you get to authorize the release? You don't call it sensitive information or it was classified. But I mean, I read the National Post article. I'm telling you what. That's pretty sensitive information, pretty classified information. So someone above you, who the owner of that intel had to give you authority to release that to the Washington Post, did you not?
So as I said many times, we have not shared classified information with the journalists. Maybe I can add that what we discussed with the journalists was exactly what we told all your leaders when we briefed your leaders.
Right. Including Mr. Poilievre.
Including Mr. Poilievre.
Thank you. And again, I don't want to play semantics, but I mean, I would consider some of the information that you told was not made public, would not normally have been made public under different circumstances. Commissioner Duheme has made that very, very clear. It could impact the criminal investigation and jeopardize the lives of many individuals. Commissioner, you stated very recently, I don't know the exact time, but within the last week or so, that you would have concerns if the 6 diplomats were to be replaced. Does that remain your position?
Yeah, my comment was that I do have concerns considering how the government of India operates, but I also shared in that same interview that I'm not familiar with the background process that's in place when a diplomat or a consular official is appointed to a country. So perhaps Mr. Morrison would be better placed to explain on the security side or checks.
I was just going to ask Mr. Morrison, do you share those same concerns, and what does that look like for global affairs?
We will continue to let the dust settle, and then there's a lot of dust, and then we will work with our counterparts to ensure that both sides have adequate representation in each other's countries. There's a process of screening where when a country applies to accredit its diplomats, we work as Global Affairs Canada with the security agencies to ensure there's no adverse information. And assuming that's the case, then we accredit new diplomats.
Thank you. And quickly, Commissioner, you had mentioned here just a couple minutes ago about it's reasonable to assume, in fact, it's occurring that India also experiences violent extremism, differently than we do here. You indicated that that's a reality. Now, is it possible that criminals from Canada are giving direction to operas in India, just like it's alleged to be vice versa to Canada?
I mean, after coming out on October 14th, anything's possible. We can't discount that, but that's the importance of working with our colleagues in India so we can work together and address the people who are involved.
Thank you. 5 minutes.
Mr. Motz. Okay, we go now to Ms. O'Connell for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I have to say, I'm quite concerned, and following on my colleague Mr. Sarai's comments, we're here at about just over an hour and a half into testimony, about 5 rounds of questions for the Conservatives. I think at least 3 of those rounds were focused on information that was done on background to the media that have confirmed that that information was not classified by the sheer fact that their own leader received the same information, and we all know he doesn't have a security clearance. So information that was provided by all leaders was also provided to the media, and Conservatives have spent at least 3 of their rounds on that issue, information that their party already had. And then what we just heard from Mr. Motz, instead of, to Mr. Sarai's point about the very real threat to community members, and I can only imagine how it felt and feels hearing these reports. Conservatives just spent a round asking about Canadian criminals in India, and not a single question about the fact that the Indian government worked with organized crime, and this is what is being alleged in the media, worked with organized crime to target Canadians with violence. There's a murder investigation. There are other investigations ongoing, and not a single question from the Conservative Party about how that might impact our community here in Canada. And to actually ask that question in terms of Canadian criminals abroad, I would think Canadians across this country, in particular in the Sikh community, the Indo-Canadian community, must find very cold comfort in what we just saw. And I don't know how to continue to not call that out for what it is. And I just think that Canadians deserve better. And so I thank all of you for being here to try and shed some of this light. We have our top security officials here for almost 2 hours, and that's the quality of question we got. I have to look at it from the community's perspective, and I'm quite disappointed that that's how that time was spent. But that is for Conservatives to answer to constituents across this country of why they would rather stand up or not call out the alleged actions of the Indian government that has been widely reported. So with that being said, I wanted to speak to Madame Drouin in terms of the sharing of that information with media. You mentioned, which was not brought up in the 3 panels of questions obsessing over that instead of safety of Canadians, but the fact that those reporters and the journalists had other sources, and that had Canadian representatives and officials not responded, that potentially the Canadian side of things, understanding that we're dealing with a lot of misinformation, would have been left unchecked? Was that part of the strategy to also ensure that information the Conservative Party already had was also shared with journalists to make sure that misinformation couldn't go unchecked?
So you're right that the strategy of using an international media outlet was to make sure that based on what I've talked earlier, misinformation from India, repeating that Canadian media are part of the Canadian strategy, using the India violence as a political mean to achieve our goals. So the idea of using an international media outlet was to make sure that the information will be widely spread and that our side of the story will be bring correctly.
Thank you. Commissioner Duheme or anyone else that'd like to comment on this, the question about the Indian government potentially, and my colleague Mr. Gahir spoke about the reference to a Bollywood plot, but the idea that perhaps the Indian government was using organized crime criminals within their country, within even their own criminal justice systems, Canada would not have been able to reach in and, let's say, arrest that individual to disrupt that. So is part of the reason for coming forward publicly was to disrupt these sorts of serious allegations and actions in areas that the police in Canada could not just in a traditional sense go and follow where the investigation leads and go pick up an individual or a criminal that may not be within our borders.
Quick answer, please.
Priority for us was public safety.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. We'll start our fourth round now with Mr. Shipley. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to witnesses for being here today. I'd just like I lost track, maybe 4, 5, 6, 9 times. My friend was keeping track in her opening question, so I think the people who are being overly partisan are perhaps on the other side of the table today. But anyways, we've got a serious issue ahead of us. They can smirk, they can laugh, but let's get into some of the questions here. First to Mr. Morrison and Ms. Drouin. An NSCOP report from 2019 stated that CSIS observed an increase in Indian threat-related activity targeting the Indo-Canadian, diaspora and government institutions. This same NSCOP report found that Indian consular officials were maintaining blacklists of dissidents, controlling travel visas to India, and recruiting community sources that were engaging MPs and political candidates to advance Indian objectives. Given that each of your organizations presumably read this report at the time and knew about these activities dating back to at least 2019, which very clearly fall outside of the norm of diplomatic activity, why did the government wait until these threats had escalated to the point of violence and murder to expel any consular officials?
I think as Nathalie said and has been testified to today, the various parts of the government have been live to the issue of foreign interference for a number of years and have been taking all kinds of measures when the situation reached its apex, as has been described, and as the RCMP has said, when they came to us and sought our help, we then used one of our heaviest diplomatic tools, which was the persona non grata tool. But I wouldn't assume that Indian foreign interference was not a constant subject of discussion throughout that time period, 2019 until the present, in all of our interactions with India.
Ms. Drouin, would you like to?
India is also a priority for the work of the service. So when it comes to the resources we deploy to identify various strategies by India, that's one of the countries we concentrate on more.
To Mr. Duheme, thank you for being here today. Through a lot of the reports we've read and a lot of the indications that a lot of this crime that we're talking about is going on here is being funneled through organized crime groups that are here in Canada. What have we done, or what have you done, or what have your group or the government done to disrupt the communication lines between organized crime groups and the Indian government to ensure this doesn't continue?
Well, the fact, Mr. Chair, that we came out publicly, that was one of the strategies we had to ensure that the message is out and that the community is aware and the community will report it, making sure that people from the community do not fall victims to influence and whatnot. And it's continuing to work with our government departments as to maintaining not oversight, but a view of what's going on in Canada with regards to Government of India's influence on criminal activities in Canada.
Thank you for that. And I have a quick question. I've really been intrigued today by Mr. Morrison and Mr. Drouin. I'm going to quote your words back to both of you. You have both said that you've decided to go to the Washington Post to make sure you went to a respected and credible newspaper. By that, do you feel there are no respected or credible newspapers in Canada?
Go back to, I think we said international outlet, sir. And this is a very
you did
important.
say you wanted to go to a respected and credible news source, and you used the Washington Post.
I think I explained that, and that has nothing to do, quite the contrary. And I also said in my opening remarks that the pretension of India are not right, but they pretend that our India file is politically motivated, and that our media are into that scheme too. So this is why we use an international outlet, because we knew that those allegations from India would resurface. So that was the nexus and the reason to go with an international outlet.
Thank you, Mr. Shipley. We'll go now to Mr. Dollarwall for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, over the past, many weeks, my constituents had come to me, and in fact, they have appreciated the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and also thanked the RCMP, Commissioner Duheme, and also Mr. Rogers, the work that CSIS has done, and community feels at ease. But on the other hand, they keep on complaining to me about the Conservatives and their leader, particularly when even today I can see the line of questioning is not focusing on the perpetrators of crime, which is agents of India. In fact, is questioning you and all those media things. I'm coming back to Mr. Rogers here. I just need more clarification. Just to clarify an earlier point, that would the leader of the opposition still need a security clearance in order to read the NSI COP report and to learn about his own leadership race, because a lot of allegations coming that agents of India were involved to install him as a leader of the Conservative Party. Would he need a security clearance to know all that? And if you can elaborate that, please.
Apologies. Thank you for the question. I have to refrain from speaking to the specifics of any intelligence, so I have to go back to what I've said before, which is that we will be able to describe more and broader sets of intelligence to people with a security clearance. In cases where that clearance is not available, we will look at the other mechanisms available to us, which might include things like threat reduction measures, or other types of information briefings, defensive briefings, or other briefings to help reduce the threat that would apply with any opposition leader or any Canadian.
Basically, on the other side, the leaders of the opposition say that it's going to be the gag orders, from whoever. But would it make sense as a responsible leader to take that clearance and get all that information so that leader can protect or can play a role to protect Canadians in a better way?
What I would say is We at the service will be able to brief more, and Madame Drouin and others may speak to this also, because classified information doesn't uniquely come from the service. There's CSE and other agencies across government, to those who have a security clearance. And I think I have to leave it at that.
Madam President, you want to add something? Thank you. And coming back to the RCMP, what lessons Commissioner, the RCMP has learned from these situations, and how will it prepare for similar scenarios not to happen in future, and the Canadian lives are safe and not at risk?
In my press conference, I did say the exceptional circumstances. One of the lessons learned here is explore other tools. If public safety is at risk, explore other tools in order to disrupt. And this is exactly what we did with reaching out to the NSIA as well as GAC to look at options, considering that the threshold for laying charges against a diplomat is fairly high, and the chance of prosecution sometimes is challenging. But considering there's an immediate public safety threat, we stepped outside and used the disruption method, which is not commonly used in the RCMP, but it's proven very well with the results that we've seen.
Dr. Rogers, I brought in a bill, private member's motion M112, and then the government took an action to bring in Bill C-70. You mentioned earlier how this Bill C-70 will help to protect Canadians in future, the tools that you got.
Thank you for the question. There are a number of things in Bill C-70 that could assist the service in dealing with foreign interference threats. I mentioned earlier that there is now a provision for us to be able to engage in resilience discussions and disclosures with people outside the federal government, and that's something we've been doing already. There are other provisions to allow things like production orders and preservation orders, which could assist our investigations. Importantly for us, there's a statutory review of our legislation, which will allow the service and its legislation to potentially keep pace with evolving technical threats. I think I can leave it at that. There are a number of other measures. Oh, I should say it also closed the gap in one of our investigative gaps, which had come to light recently, where CSIS was unable to collect information about a threat actor in Canada if that information resided outside of Canada. That could certainly be applied in a foreign interference context, and that was resolved with Bill C-70 also.
Thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal. We go encore, Madame.
Once again, Ms. Michaud, please go ahead for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McGregor spoke about the relationship with our allies and what all this means to the situation with India. And Mr. Morrison, you were saying earlier that in the Washington Post article, you wanted to talk to your allies and send a message to counter the disinformation from India. So my first question is, why did you decide to talk to your allies through the media? Is it because you were targeting the public in allied countries? I imagine there were already conversations going on with the allies. And my second question, what does this mean for our relationship with other countries that engage in foreign interference in Canadian institutions? The fact that India doesn't want to cooperate, what does it indicate? Even though you said we're not in the same place at all with what we're experiencing with India, Russia, China. We're not at the same stage. Well, what does this mean for Canada's relationship with countries like China and Russia? Maybe Ms. Drouin or whoever is in a position to answer.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. With regard to the first part of your question about the allies, we did talk with our allies a lot before we went to Singapore.
Is not unique to Canada. We've mentioned the Five Eyes. I have mentioned that we did things in lockstep with our allies all the way through Singapore and when we returned to Singapore, and frankly since, because other countries are also talking to India. And I don't mind saying our media strategy continues as well, because there are various ways to send messages and to correct the record, because believe me, India is coming at us full force with their own narrative, which simply doesn't add up. So allies have been an important part of this from the beginning, as have strategic public communications.
Merci, Madame. We go now to Mr. McGregor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You know, the whole subject of foreign interference, I mean, I've heard it from my couple of years at this committee. You know, we know the Iranian diaspora would have something to say about the government of Iran. I've heard from the Tibetan community about what the People's Republic of China is engaged in, and now, of course, the South Asian community with respect to the government of India. And you know, in my riding, I have a large South Asian population as well. I have the historic Temple of Paldi is in my riding of Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. And so I think, to an earlier point, the attention on the government of India is validating what many in that community have known for quite some time right now. And I think my questions will be both to Director Rogers and to Commissioner Duheme. I don't doubt for a second that the men and women in your respective agencies are going to work every day and treating this with utmost serious. But, you know, as a parliamentarian, it's also my job to hold you to account. And I can't escape the fact that in the most recent NSICOP report, they did label Canada as a low-risk, high-reward environment in which our foreign adversaries are able to operate. And I know sources have reported to CBC News that the clandestine Indian network is still largely in place. You might see some elements of that disappear and go more quiet. But I guess my question, maybe I'll start with you, Director Rogers, is, you know, how do we flip those terms around? And with the passage of Bill C-70, do you feel confident that we're now on a path towards making Canada a high-risk, low-reward environment to operate for our foreign adversaries?
I think that's a very important question. I think I would start by saying I think the extraordinary circumstances around these events and the fact that RCMP has gone public has demonstrated the seriousness with which we take the issue. And I have to imagine that that will set the tone, that this is not a permissive environment for the government of India to operate. And I think, and others, certainly. I mean, I think that this sets a very clear tone, that this is not something that would be accepted in Canada. You're absolutely right that the people within the service will be very diligently pursuing foreign interference from all countries who may seek to perpetrate it here in Canada, including India, China, and others.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Quick answer, sure, go ahead.
Again, tying it into our public media event on the 14th, it's about education. It's about letting people know that we're there, we want to work with them. Any criminal investigation, being a theft of bike or a fraud check, it starts with people coming forward talking to us. And I can appreciate that some of the communities are reticent to come and approach because of their experience with the police in their own in their own respective country. But we want people to come forward, and we want to educate people. And the other challenge that we sometimes face is all this is done in a clandestine manner. So until people come forward, or if information is given to us in which we can launch an investigation, we're unhappy. But we want people to make sure that we're there, and the message is that we are working with all departments, service. We work hand in hand with the service on many, many of the files.
Thank you. Ms. Dancho, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, thank you to all the witnesses for being here. It is quite the panel that we have, the Commissioner of the RCMP, the National Security Advisor, the Director of CSIS, and 2 top-level Deputy Ministers for Public Safety and Global Affairs. I appreciate your time very much and your commitment to national security in this country. I have no doubt that you all work extremely hard to keep Canadians safe. And ultimately, of course, you all answer to the Prime Minister in some way or another. He is the head of our government. And you'll recall certainly in the 2015 when Mr. Trudeau first became Prime Minister, he they released, or a document was released called Open and Accountable Government. I'm sure you're all familiar. It mentions in there that as the head of government, the Prime Minister has special responsibility for national security, federal, provincial, territorial relations, and the conduct of international affairs. Do you all agree that he is the head of our national security apparatus, the Prime Minister? Does anyone disagree with that? No. So the responsibility ultimately ends with him, as you have agreed. And we are in a circumstance here where multiple individuals, one for sure, and perhaps others, according to the Washington Post article, have been murdered through direct ties to the government of India. Quite an extraordinary situation on our hands. We also have a situation where we have a foreign interference inquiry with Justice Hogue, where the real center of that is that China has been interfering in multiple elections, looking to undermine our democracy. We have misinformation en masse from Russia. We have issues from Iran. We have issues from Pakistan, others. Canada, from my understanding, has never quite been in this type of, we'll call it a pickle, to put it blunt, to put it lightly, where so many adversaries and others who we thought were certainly friends are coming at Canada from all angles. Is there any other time in history you can point to Canada facing this many threats in this way domestically from foreign actors? Is there any other time in the last 2 generations, for example?
Si vous me permettez, peut-être ce que je peux dire, c'est que il est vrai.
What I could say is that it's true we have to take seriously any attempt at foreign interference. I think that some of us here stated that during the last election, elections were fair and were not marked by the consequences of foreign interference. As parliamentarians, you adopted Bill C-170.
But that wasn't specifically my question. I do appreciate your commentary in response to my commentary, but that was not directly answering my question. But I'll just put that aside for now. As actually our colleague from the NDP mentioned, the NCCOP report labeled Canada a low-risk, high-reward for foreign adversaries, in essence, to come to Canada and wreak havoc and cause a lot of crime and chaos and even death now from India, for example, as you've mentioned. And so my concern is that the leadership from the top, given the only individual ultimately responsible for national security, and we have death on our hands. We had 13 more individuals in peril. From an objective analysis, things are not going that well in Canada. I appreciate there's things that you've done that we'll never know, but we should be grateful for. I appreciate that very much. But the fact that there's individuals being murdered in Canada is beyond comprehension from a foreign government. I'm sure you would agree. From our perspective as the official opposition tasked with holding the Liberal government accountable, this is an abject failure to maintain national security. The fact that individuals have been murdered, the fact that there are communities in this country, the Sikh community, for example, that have felt incredibly vulnerable under the so-called leadership of the current Prime Minister. So I think that really is the reason we are here is because he has failed to maintain national security. The reason we have the national inquiry into foreign interference is because there's been a failure to maintain the integrity of our democracy in terms of its attacks from China, and the confidence that creates, the confidence issue that creates across Canada is deeply concerning, and the message that sends to other adversaries that they could take advantage of our democratic process and our trusting nature. So I think that really needs to be underlined in the sense that you can only do what your limitations are, what the leadership of this country are. So I just wanted to underline that because I feel that there seems to be an obsession with members opposite with the opposition leader, when I wish that the Liberal members would apply that same energy to holding their own Prime Minister accountable for failing to stop the murders of a number of people in Canada from a foreign government, for failing to stop interference into our elections. That's really quite a frustrating matter that has happened under their watch as they've been part of the Liberal government. And so, Mr. Chair, I just conclude that, again, I thank you for your efforts, and I appreciate very much what you've done to protect Canadians and to fill the gaps for the lack of leadership from our Prime Minister to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. We go now to Mr. Sarai for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to remind those that are watching, or maybe the press that's here, or others that are paying attention to this, that this study is on, quote, electoral interference and criminal activities by agents of the government of India. but it seems to be only 3 parties are asking questions on this study, while one party is asking questions based on a new love affair with Canadian journalism. So it's pretty interesting that all of a sudden there's a big love affair with Canadian journalists over international journalists. So I'm pretty intrigued in that, and I hope that goes further in terms of supporting journalism in Canada. My question is, part of this study focuses on disinformation tactics employed by the government of India, and I'm very pleased to hear that there is actually a media strategy employed on this file. Can somebody elaborate for me, what are the hallmarks of Indian disinformation with some examples?
Security advisor has spoken a bit about some of the tactics that we've seen in this very particular case. I think what we have to say is that there is a deep concern that these activities are happening not just from one country but from multiple countries. One of the things we've talked a bit about today and need to continue to talk about is how do we ensure resilience of Canadians? How do we ensure that they are well informed about efforts to disinform or misinform them? There's more to be done in that space. That's an effort ongoing by the Department of Public Safety amongst other colleagues. We're well informed by the intelligence from the service, from the RCMP and the tactics that are being used. But right now what we really need to focus on is how do we increase resilience so that Canadians are able to detect that and able to make sure that they're not affected by it.
We have seen in the past, Canada even, I think, prohibit Russian broadcasters, Russian television, I believe, to work on Canadian networks because of that disinformation. And what I'm hearing from our diaspora and other members here as well is when they watch a lot of international news, unfortunately, they're watching a lot of the propaganda coming from that country. In particular, under this matter, they're hearing that India is actually that Canada's harboring terrorists. They're only going after terrorists. They're actually justifying it, and it's saying that Canada is actually accepting terrorists and giving them a free rein. What are we doing to counter that narrative that's being spewed into Canadians? Because unfortunately, some diaspora populations watch international news more than Canadian broadcasters.
3 parts of the strategy. One, we've talked a bit about some of the media strategy that we've employed recently. We at Public Safety are working very closely with colleagues at the Department of Heritage who also have engagement with the CRT, amongst others, in terms of how do we manage that at the macro level? How do we deal with some of the outlets that are propagating that dis and misinformation? So there's work to be done there. We also spoke about direct engagement with Canadians, though. I think that some of the outreach, the engagement, the trust and confidence that we're talking about, all of that is also going to have significant impacts in terms of making sure that Canadians understand when they are being affected by dis and misinformation. So,
thank you. Mr. Rogers, as we've seen in the U.S. indictments against Vikas Yadav and Nikhil Gupta, Indian foreign interference and transnational repression is not isolated to Canada. What work is CSIS doing to engage with our American and other Five Eyes partners to disrupt Indian transnational repression?
Thank you for the question. So, as Mr. Morrison said earlier, we are working very closely with our allies, and this includes intelligence sharing. CSIS will share intelligence that it has about India's tactics here in Canada. We will compare that with the intelligence we have around from our allies, and we'll work together to identify and further techniques that we can use to disrupt those activities. I think intelligence sharing is a start. I also think it's important that CSIS continue to build relationships with segments of society who can help us to inform us about what they're experiencing, and that we can provide guidance where possible. And I know that's something we'll also do in accordance with our Five Eyes allies.
And reporting on India's involvement in criminality and transnational repression has focused on India's external spy agency, the Research and Analysis Wing, RAW. What can CSIS tell the committee about how the Research and Analysis Wing functions, and particularly here in Canada?
I don't think I can speak to the specifics of that in this case, particularly as a number of the elements of that would be linked to RCMP's investigation. I can say that CSIS has had a relationship with RAW, and I think that we have said publicly before that we've seen that Indian proxies in Canada working at the behest of the government of India can do that with India's intelligence apparatus both here and abroad, but I'll limit my comments to that for today.
Mr. I don't know about my time, but Mr. Duheme, Can the RCMP advise what Canadian Sikhs can do to keep themselves safe in Canada and secure in times where they feel they are at major risk, even going to a place of worship and praying or participating in any activities that they feel are lawfully allowed in Canada? What measures can they take, and how can they work with your office?
To what I said previously, if you see it, to hear it, report it. Make sure that we're involved early on, and we want to continue the engagement with the different communities to build that relationship so there's a free flow of information with police and the community.
Mr. Sarai. And thank you all for being here today and for all of your excellent testimony. And no doubt we will be in contact with all of you at some point down the road as well. So thank you very much. We are adjourned. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed to the chair. Members, please raise your hand if you wish to speak, whether participating in person or via Zoom. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. So pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2 and the motion adopted on October 22nd, 2024, the committee commences its study of electoral interference and criminal activities in Canada from agents of the Government of India. I would now like to welcome our witnesses today. From the Privy Council Office, we have Nathalie Drouin, Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council Office and National Security and Intelligence Advisor to the Prime Minister. From the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, we have Daniel Rogers, Director. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, David Morrison, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Tricia Geddes, Associate Deputy Minister. And from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we have Michael Duheme, Commissioner. So thank you all for being here today on short notice, and I understand Ms. Drouin will be leaving in the coming days, so it was really great that we could all fit you in on this day. It has been agreed that Ms. Drouin will make an opening statement on behalf of the entire panel. I yield the floor to you, Ms. Drouin. Go ahead, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, dear members of the committee. My colleagues and I would like to thank the committee for the invitation to speak with you today regarding public safety of Canadians and foreign interference as it relates to the Government of India. As this committee will understand, while we are here in full collaboration and ready to answer your questions, you are convening this meeting in the middle of important public security investigations, which therefore limit what we can share. We are not in a position to provide details on evidence. However, we can share with you the rationale for concern for public safety, and we can speak about our attempts at cooperation with India and how India's refusal to cooperate led us to where we are today.
Law enforcement has been investigating extreme violence within communities, and CSIS has been looking into India foreign interference for years. As you are aware, on September 18 of last year, the Prime Minister announced in the House of Commons that Canada became aware of credible allegation based on intelligence of a potential link between the killing of a Canadian citizen in Canada and agent of the Government of India. Since the Prime Minister's statement last year, the government's response has followed two separate tracks: law enforcement and diplomatic. The diplomatic track addresses our relations with the Government of India in many areas. And the law enforcement track has focused on public safety and the application of the rule of law. Public safety of Canadians has been the paramount consideration for all our actions when evaluating our relationship with India. We do understand and value